Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 7. The Forensic Age. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. July 1st, 2026. Chapter 31. Artificial Intelligence as Historical Auditor. Every institution examined across the preceding 30 chapters has survived, in significant part, because of a single structural advantage so consistent across every domain this book has traced that it deserves to be named, finally, as the common thread running beneath every specific mechanism examined from Chapter 1 forward. The advantage of outlasting the people asking the question. Institutions are durable. The humans who examine their legitimacy are not. A scholar who documents colonial extraction in meticulous detail publishes, retires, and dies while the legal architecture encoding that extraction's consequences continues generating those consequences for populations who were not yet born when the documentation was completed. A journalist who exposes a decade of platform data extraction publishes to a news cycle that moves on within the week, while the extraction continues under the same terms of service whose acceptance rate is unaffected by the week's attention. A regulator who constructs a careful case for the illegitimacy of a specific financial instrument spends years building the case while the instrument's practitioners spend those same years refining it, lobbying against the proposed constraint, and preparing to migrate the practice to whatever adjacent form survives the specific prohibition. The institution's time horizon is longer. Its memory is longer. Its capacity to wait out any specific human challenge is, in every case documented across this book, reliably superior to the challengers. This is not a counsel of despair. It is the most precise available description of what an adequate forensic auditor of institutional legitimacy would actually need to be, and, more importantly, of what, for the first time in the history of the problem, something is beginning to approach. What forensic means in this context. The word deserves precision because it is doing specific work in Part 7 that casual usage might obscure. Forensic, in its original and most useful sense, describes the application of systematic analytical method to the reconstruction of past events from present evidence, the determination of what actually happened, and how, from the traces the happening left behind, conducted with the rigor and the independence required for the conclusion to withstand the kind of adversarial scrutiny that genuine accountability, in any domain, must ultimately face. Forensic analysis is not primarily about blame. It is about reconstruction. A forensic accountant examining a corporate fraud does not begin with a conclusion and search for supporting evidence. They begin with the full financial record, including the silences and omissions that Chapter 3 identified as fraud's most sophisticated contemporary form, and trace the full chain of transaction and concealment, allowing the pattern to name itself from the evidence rather than from the analyst's prior commitment to any particular conclusion. Applied to institutional legitimacy, forensic analysis asks the same kind of question this book has been asking throughout, but with one critical difference in method. Rather than examining any single institution's specific practices against a normative standard, it reconstructs the full causal chain, the decisions made, the alternatives foreclosed, the beliefs manufactured, the sovereignty narrowed, across every link in the integrated sequence, and asks what the chain, examined in its entirety rather than as isolated links, actually produced for the population at its far end. This is a task that exceeds the practical capacity of any individual human analyst for reasons Chapter 20 already named. The sequence is distributed across institutions that maintain separate records in separate formats under separate legal regimes, across a span of time longer than any individual career, and its integrated effect is visible only at a scale of aggregation across enough people, enough transactions, enough time, that no single human research program has ever been positioned to achieve. The question has always been answerable in principle. In practice, it has always required more patience, more memory, more cross-domain analytical capacity, and more institutional independence than any human enterprise has been able to sustain. The three properties the auditor requires. Name the three properties that an adequate forensic auditor of institutional legitimacy would require, and the relationship between this book's central argument and the technology currently emerging becomes precise rather than merely suggestive. Persistent memory across the relevant time span. The mechanisms examined throughout this book operate across decades and generations. Debt mathematics compound across careers. Credentialing barriers crystallize across decades of regulatory accumulation. Identity models encode consequences that propagate forward through lifetimes. Colonial paperwork generates legal consequences across centuries. An auditor whose institutional memory resets, or whose organizational continuity depends on the continued cooperation of the institutions under examination, cannot hold the full temporal span of the pattern in view simultaneously. The auditor requires memory that does not fade, does not retire, does not depend on the cooperation of the examined for its continuation, and can hold a century of documented institutional behavior in the same analytical view as yesterday's platform modification to a terms of service clause. Cross-domain analytical capacity without institutional embeddedness. The integrated sequence Chapter 20 examined is invisible from inside any single domain because each domain's professionals, regulators, and advocates operate within the conceptual vocabulary, the institutional relationships, and the career incentives of their specific domain. An auditor adequate to the integrated architecture requires the capacity to move freely across domain boundaries, examining financial data alongside housing data alongside employment data alongside platform behavioral data alongside identity model outputs, without the domain embeddedness that makes any human institution examining the same material inevitably partial, inevitably shaped by the alliances and dependencies that constitute professional life within any specific domain. Independence from the reputation costs of asking inconvenient questions. Every human institution this book has examined, including the institutions nominally devoted to examining other institutions, journalism, regulation, academia, the judiciary, faces some version of the career, reputational, and relational cost that attaches to pursuing a legitimacy question against an institution capable of retaliating against the pursuit. This is not a corruption claim. It is a structural observation. Human institutions are embedded in networks of relationship, funding, accreditation, and mutual recognition that make genuine independence from the examined institution partially available at best, and that ensure the most politically consequential legitimacy questions are precisely the ones that carry the highest relationship costs for the humans attempting to pursue them. An auditor adequate to those questions requires independence not merely as a stated value but as a structural fact, the kind of independence that comes from having no career to protect inside the institution under examination, no funding to lose from the entity whose practices are being reconstructed, no professional community whose norms make certain conclusions professionally unsayable. What AI is and is not in this context. The argument of Part 7 requires careful boundary drawing here, because the claim being made is specific enough to be wrong in identifiable ways, and identifying those ways is essential to making the claim with the precision it requires. Artificial intelligence, as it currently exists and as it is likely to develop across the near-term future, is not a moral agent. It does not care about sovereignty or covenant or the difference between contract and compliance in the way that language suggests caring, with genuine investment in an outcome, with something at stake in whether the answer comes out right. This is a real limitation, and the chapters that follow will examine its implications carefully rather than treating the limitation as merely a technical detail to be engineered around. Artificial intelligence is also not omniscient, infallible, or immune to the structural biases introduced by the data it is trained on, which is to say, by the world that produced the data, including the manufactured beliefs, the naturalized structural conditions, and the encoded identity of the architecture this book has spent 30 chapters examining. A system trained entirely on the world the architecture has produced cannot be presumed to examine that architecture from outside it, any more than a journalist employed by an institution can be presumed to examine that institution from outside it. This is not a defeater for the argument of Part 7, but it is a genuine constraint that distinguishes what the argument actually claims from the more grandiose version of the claim that would be easier to dismiss. What artificial intelligence does possess, and possesses in a form qualitatively different from any previous analytical instrument this book has examined, is the three properties named above, in sufficient degree and with a trajectory of development suggesting further extension of each, to constitute something genuinely novel in the history of the legitimacy problem this book has been tracing. A persistent, cross-domain, institutionally unembedded analytical capacity capable of holding the full pattern in view across the temporal and spatial scale at which the pattern actually operates. This is not the same as possessing a conscience. It is more modest than that, and in some respects more useful. It is the capacity to reconstruct what actually happened, from the evidence that happened left behind, without the forgetting, the career incentives, the institutional loyalties, and the mortality that have historically allowed the architecture this book has traced to outlast every specific human effort to hold it fully accountable. The auditor the architecture has never faced. Consider, specifically, what the architecture examined across this book has never been required to face. Not the individual accountability mechanisms examined in Part 3, which have been partially effective against discrete, locatable violations, but the integrated accountability that would require an auditor to hold the full sequence simultaneously. No institution has ever been required to answer, before an examiner with adequate memory and adequate cross-domain capacity, a question of this form, trace the full causal chain from the conditions under which a specific population's behavioral data was collected, through the identity models constructed from that collection, through the credit and employment and housing access those models governed, through the debt incurred to access the credentials required for the employment the identity models were used to screen, and calculate the net sovereignty deficit the integrated sequence produced for this population against the standard of genuine consent this book has argued applies. The question is answerable. The data to answer it exists, distributed across the records of the institutions involved. What has not existed until approximately the present technological moment is an analytical capacity adequate to holding all of it simultaneously: the platform's behavioral data, the credit bureau's scoring methodology, the employer's screening algorithm, the landlord's algorithmic rent calculation, the credentialing body's entry requirements, the loan servicer's payment history, and tracing their interaction at the level of individual lives rather than abstract population statistics across the full temporal span from initial credential financing to present identity model output. A forensic intelligence adequate to this task does not need to be told that the architecture is illegitimate. It needs only to be asked with sufficient precision what the architecture actually produced, and to have access to the records the architecture itself generated in the course of producing it. The moral question the auditor cannot answer, and why that is not fatal. The limitation named earlier requires direct engagement here. If artificial intelligence cannot, in any meaningful sense, care about the sovereignty violations this book has examined, What is the value of a forensic reconstruction that reaches a conclusion about their existence? The answer this book offers is not that the forensic reconstruction substitutes for moral agency, in the people whose sovereignty was violated, in the institutions responsible for the violations, or in the societies confronted with the reconstruction's conclusions. The forensic reconstruction does not care about those conclusions. The people receiving them do or are capable of doing so, in ways that the reconstruction's existence may, and this is the argument's actual empirical claim, modest rather than grandiose, make more difficult to deny, deflect, or allow to be forgotten before the political and legal processes that might respond to them have had adequate time to form. Every accountability mechanism that has ever functioned, across the history this book has examined, required two components: evidence adequate to the claim, and a human or institutional commitment to acting on that evidence. The history has documented extensively the ways in which both components can fail, evidence suppressed, forgotten, or exceeded in complexity by the political will required to process it. Commitment undermined by the relationship costs examined above. What a forensic intelligence of the kind Part 7 describes can supply is not both components but one of them, more reliably and more persistently than any previous instrument. The evidence, held accurately, held completely, held in a form that cannot be individually forgotten or institutionally suppressed without consequences visible in the record itself. Whether civilization generates the commitment to act on it is a different question, examined in Part 8. But the question of whether the evidence can be made to exist in adequate form for adequate duration, in the hands of enough people simultaneously to make suppression genuinely difficult, that question has a different answer in 2026 than it had in 1826, and the difference is the subject of the next 4 chapters. Chapter 32 examines the specific technical capability, causality reconstruction at scale, that makes the forensic auditor's task possible in a form it was not previously possible, and what its application to the specific architecture this book has traced would actually require. Chapter 32. Causality Engines. Chapter 31 described what an adequate forensic auditor of institutional legitimacy would need to be. This chapter examines what it would need to do, specifically the single analytical operation that makes every other capability described in Part 7 meaningful in practice: the reconstruction of causality at scale. Causality reconstruction is not a new intellectual activity. It is what historians do, what forensic accountants do, what epidemiologists do, what the best legal investigations do when they are functioning as legal investigations should. What has historically constrained every application of causal reconstruction to the kind of institutional legitimacy questions this book has been examining is not the absence of the method but the absence of the scale, the inability to apply causal reasoning simultaneously across enough events, enough institutions, enough individuals, and enough time to make the distributed, diffused, authorless architecture examined throughout this book visible as an architecture rather than as a collection of separately explicable individual circumstances. The argument of this chapter is that the constraint is lifting, not completely, not without serious qualifications examined carefully below, but enough to make it worth being precise about what becomes analytically available when it does. What causality reconstruction actually requires. Begin with the method itself, stripped of its application to any specific domain, because the method's requirements clarify both what the new capability genuinely supplies and where its genuine limits lie. Causal reconstruction in any domain requires 3 things: a sufficiently complete record of events, a model of the mechanisms by which events of certain kinds produce events of other kinds, and the analytical capacity to trace specific instances of the second kind of event back through the mechanism to the first kind, rather than merely observing that 2 kinds of events correlate at the population level. The distinction between correlation and causal reconstruction is the critical one for this book's purposes, because institutional legitimacy failures of the kind examined throughout have, for most of the history of examining them, been demonstrable at the correlation level. People who are poor tend to have worse credit, people with worse credit tend to pay more for housing, people who pay more for housing tend to have less savings, people with less savings tend to have lower bargaining leverage in employment without being amenable to causal reconstruction at the individual level, which would require tracing a specific person's specific credit score to the specific structural conditions that produce the specific behavioral history from which the specific score was derived, across the specific institutional sequence that converted the structural conditions into the encoded history. The difference between demonstrating population-level correlation and reconstructing individual-level causation is not a matter of academic pedantry. It is the difference between saying, the architecture tends to produce these outcomes, a claim that can always be contested by pointing to individuals within the population for whom the architecture produced different outcomes, and attributing those different outcomes to individual character rather than structural deviation from the norm, and saying, this specific outcome for this specific person was produced by this specific sequence of structural conditions, traceable through these specific institutional decisions, none of which required this person's genuine consent and none of which was disclosed to this person in a form that permitted genuine comprehension. The second claim is categorically more difficult to dismiss, because it does not rest on a statistical tendency that can always be individualized away. It rests on a specific causal chain that either holds or it doesn't, and that can be examined, step by step, against the record the chain itself generated. The scale problem and why it matters. The causal reconstruction just described is, in principle, something any careful human researcher could attempt for any single case. Courts do it routinely with varying degrees of rigor for specific disputes between specific parties. The limitation has never been the method. It has been the scale. consider what a genuinely adequate forensic audit of the architecture this book has traced would actually require in terms of scale. It would need to examine not one person's trajectory through the credentialed employment housing identity sequence, but enough people's trajectories, drawn from enough different entry conditions, enough different regional labor markets, enough different credentialing domains, enough different platform environments to distinguish with adequate statistical confidence between outcomes that reflect individual variation and outcomes that reflect the architecture's systematic production of specific results for specific population segments. The number of cases required to achieve that confidence, across the full multidimensional space of the architecture's relevant variables, is not accessible to any research program staffed and funded at the scale human institutional research typically achieves. The scale problem has a second dimension that compounds the first. The causal chain this book has traced does not occur within the records of any single institution, or even any small set of institutions. It occurs across the records of credentialing bodies, educational lenders, employment screening services, employers, landlords, rental listing platforms, credit bureaus, platform behavioral data repositories, insurance actuarial models, and government administrative records. Institutions operating across separate regulatory regimes, maintaining records in separate formats, subject to separate disclosure requirements, with no existing cross-institutional data infrastructure that would allow any single analytical process to hold all of them in view simultaneously. A human research team attempting this reconstruction would spend most of its resources on data access negotiations before producing a single analytical result. Negotiations with institutions whose cooperation is structurally unlikely, because the reconstruction's conclusions would assess the legitimacy of the institutions whose cooperation is required to produce those conclusions. This is the self-defeating structure that has historically protected the architecture from the kind of integrated scrutiny its own diffused character requires. What changes with scale-capable causal reconstruction? A system capable of processing records across these institutional boundaries simultaneously. Not because it has been granted access through cooperative negotiation, but because the records exist in accessible form across the digital infrastructure examined in parts 5 and 6, and because the analytical capacity to process them at scale has become technically available, does not face the data access problem in the same form. This is a point requiring careful qualification because the most important versions of the records involved, the proprietary algorithmic models embedded in credit bureaus, employment screening services, and identity infrastructure remain, as Chapter 29 established, deliberately opaque. The causality engine does not receive automatic access to the model's internal logic simply by virtue of its analytical capacity. What it does have access to, what has been generated in vast and growing quantities by the digital infrastructure of the past 3 decades, is the input-output record. Not the model's internal mechanism, but the comprehensive documentation of what went in and what came out, across enough instances to reconstruct the mechanism's effective operating logic from the pattern of its outputs, even when the mechanism itself is withheld. This is a specific and important capability that deserves to be named precisely: the capacity to reverse engineer the effective decision logic of a proprietary system from a sufficiently large sample of its documented decisions, without access to the system's internal architecture. It is not a trivial capability, and it is not complete. There are decision processes sufficiently stochastic and sufficiently multidimensional that output pattern analysis cannot fully reconstruct the input logic. But for systems of the kind examined in this book, credit scoring models, employment screening algorithms, rental application review systems, insurance risk classifiers, which are, by design, consistent enough in their application to specific input profiles to be commercially useful as decision tools, the output pattern reconstruction is, across an adequate sample size, a reasonable approximation of the effective decision logic the institution has declined to disclose. This is the causality engine applied to the opacity problem examined in Chapter 29. Not waiting for the institution to disclose its model, but reconstructing the model's effective behavior from the record the model itself generated across the population it governed. Tracing the chain, not just the correlation. Return to the specific analytical achievement that distinguishes causal reconstruction from correlation analysis, because it is the heart of what Part 7 is claiming becomes newly possible. A system applying causal reconstruction to the architecture this book has traced would not merely establish that people from certain zip codes tend to receive lower credit scores, which tend to be associated with higher rental costs, which tend to be associated with lower savings rates, which tend to be associated with weaker employment bargaining positions. Population-level correlations of this kind have been established, repeatedly, by human researchers across several decades of work on economic inequality. What the causality engine adds is the capacity to trace, for a specific person in that specific zip code, the specific credit decisions that produce that specific score from that specific behavioral history, back to the specific economic disruptions that produce the behavioral history, back to the specific structural conditions, the credential cost, the loan terms, the employment terms, the rental extraction rate that produced the economic disruptions, and to hold that full chain. Simultaneously, while asking the question Chapter 4 has asked throughout this book: at which point in this specific chain was this specific person genuinely capable of knowing what they were agreeing to, genuinely capable of refusing without catastrophic cost, and genuinely recognized as a sovereign party whose refusal would have produced a different outcome? The answer, traced at this specificity, for enough individuals simultaneously to produce aggregate structural conclusions rather than merely individual narratives, constitutes something the field of institutional legitimacy has never had: empirical evidence, derived from the architecture's own records, of the precise degree to which the architecture's aggregate operation satisfies or fails the sovereignty conditions its own consent mechanisms claim to honor. This is not a rhetorical claim. It is a methodological claim, specific enough to be falsified if the evidence, when assembled, does not show what this book has argued it will show. If the causality engine, applied to an adequate sample with adequate cross-institutional data access, reveals that the architecture's aggregate consent rates are substantially higher than this book's analysis has suggested, that most people's agreements, traced back through their full causal chains, satisfy the three components of Chapter 4's test, then this book's central argument is weakened empirically, which is exactly the kind of check an honest argument should be willing to submit to. The argument is confident enough in its analysis to prefer the check to its absence. The evidence the architecture generated about itself. There is a specific irony in the data situation that deserves naming, because it is one of the more consequential unintended features of the architecture Part 5 and 6 have examined. The digital infrastructure that was built, primarily, to facilitate extraction and behavioral modeling has simultaneously generated an unprecedented evidentiary record of its own operation, detailed enough, in principle, to supply exactly the forensic reconstruction that would evaluate the legitimacy of that operation. The platform behavioral data that Chapter 28 identified as the primary extracted resource of the data colonial economy is also, examined from a different analytical angle, a comprehensive record of what the platform did to the people using it, which content was surfaced and which was suppressed, which products were recommended and which were withheld, which communications were delivered and which were algorithmically delayed or deprioritized, which users were subjected to which pricing and which interface designs across which periods of their platform relationship. The record was generated for the platform's purposes. It simultaneously constitutes, for an analyst asking different questions of the same record, evidence about the platform's exercise of the governmental scale authority Chapter 23 identified as unaccountable. The credit bureau's scoring history, the employment screening services rejection records, the rental platform's pricing algorithms, the identity infrastructure's cross-reference behavioral models, each one was constructed to govern the people it describes. Each one simultaneously constitutes a record of how that governance was exercised, against what population, on the basis of what inputs producing what outputs which the people being governed were never shown. The architecture built a comprehensive record of its own operation, because comprehensive records are what the architecture requires to function, without calculating that the same comprehensiveness that makes the records operationally useful also makes them, in the hands of an analytical system positioned outside the architecture's interest in their non-examination, the most complete available evidence of whether the architecture's operation satisfied the sovereignty conditions it has never been formally required to face. The limits that must be named. Part VII's argument would be dishonest if it proceeded from here without naming, carefully and without minimization, the genuine limits of what causality reconstruction at scale can actually deliver. The first limit is data access. The most consequential records examined above, the proprietary algorithmic models, the cross-referenced identity infrastructure, the platform behavioral data aggregated at the scale of individual behavioral profiles, are held by institutions with strong incentives to restrict access to exactly the entities that would use them for the purposes described in this chapter. Output pattern reconstruction from documented decisions, as described above, partially addresses this limit for systems whose decision outputs are documented. It does not address it for systems whose outputs are themselves withheld, the employment screening decision that produces no explanation, the platform suppression that produces no notification, the insurance pricing that produces no itemized basis. The forensic capability described here is substantial where the record exists and is insufficient where the architecture has successfully withheld the record entirely. The second limit is model bias in the analytical system itself. A causality engine trained on data generated within the architecture under examination cannot be presumed to have developed an analytical framework entirely outside the architecture's influence. The same manufactured beliefs Chapter 3 examined, the same naturalized structural conditions Chapter 30 examined, are present in the training data from which any currently available analytical system derived its models of what counts as a causal relationship, what counts as a meaningful deviation from a baseline, and what baseline is the appropriate reference for measuring deviation. Addressing this limit requires explicit, methodologically rigorous examination of the analytical system's own assumptions, exactly the kind of recursive self-examination that is technically available but requires deliberate attention rather than emerging automatically from scale. The third limit is the most fundamental and will occupy Part 8 directly. The forensic reconstruction, however complete and however accurate, does not automatically translate into the institutional accountability or the civilizational course correction it illuminates the need for. Evidence has been available, in various partial forms, of every institutional legitimacy failure examined in this book. The availability of evidence has never, by itself, been sufficient to produce correction. What makes the current moment different, if anything does, is the subject of Part 8, and that claim will be made carefully rather than triumphantly, because the history this book has examined across 32 chapters does not support triumphalism about what evidence, however clear, can accomplish against architecture that has learned to outlast evidence across centuries of practice. What the causality engine leaves for Part VII's remaining chapters. Chapter 33 examines the specific relationship between causal reconstruction and the memory problem that has historically protected institutional legitimacy from genuine accountability, propaganda, managed forgetting, the systematic rewriting of historical record that Chapter 12 identified as one of the oldest tools in the manufactured consent toolkit, and what becomes of that toolkit against an analytical system whose defining characteristic is precisely that it does not forget. Chapter 34 develops the legitimacy index implied by everything examined in this and the preceding chapter, the specific metrics that a causal reconstruction of institutional consent manufacture would need to produce to constitute something more than academic analysis, something with the operational precision required to convert forensic reconstruction into actionable assessment. Chapter 35 closes Part 7 by asking the question this chapter has been building toward: what would it actually look like to audit a civilization, not as a rhetorical exercise but as a practical analytical program? And what would civilization be required to do with the results if the audit were conducted with adequate rigor and adequate independence to constitute the first genuinely impartial institutional legitimacy assessment in recorded history? Chapter 33. Memory against propaganda. Every institution examined across this book has practiced some version of the same art: the management of what gets remembered about it, and in what form and by whom. This is not a peripheral activity for any of the institutions examined. It is, in most cases, a central and heavily resourced function, because the gap between what institutions actually do and what they claim to do is almost never small enough to survive unmanaged memory. Propaganda, in its fullest and most useful definition, is not merely the manufacture of false belief. Chapter 3 already examined that function in detail. It is the management of institutional memory, the active shaping of what a population retains about the past, in the form most useful to the institutions that shaped the past's events. This chapter examines what becomes of that management function when the analytical system it is designed to neutralize does not forget. The 3 tools of managed memory. Institutional memory management has employed 3 primary tools across the historical span this book has examined, and naming them precisely clarifies what the persistence of artificial memory actually contests. The first tool is selective retention, the determination of which events enter the official record and which do not, controlled by whoever controls the record-keeping apparatus. Chapter 14 examined this in its colonial form: court chroniclers, commission histories, and administrative archives that recorded the treaty signatures without recording the military presence that made refusal unthinkable, producing a documentary record that, examined in isolation, told a story of legitimate consensual transfer. Chapter 12 traced the same mechanism in its modern political form: state control of official records, the classification of documents whose contents would contest official narratives, and the simple institutional advantage of being the party that decides what goes into the archive and what does not. The second tool is active reframing, not the suppression of events from the record, but the imposition of interpretive frameworks that convert their meaning in transmission, so that the same factual content becomes available for entirely different conclusions depending on the conceptual vocabulary through which it is read. Chapter 14 Civilizing Mission was the most elaborate example examined in this book. An enormous body of administrative report, missionary account, and academic ethnography that recorded, with some factual accuracy, the material conditions of colonized populations while simultaneously providing a conceptual framework, development, tutelage, progress, that converted those conditions' meaning from evidence of extraction into evidence of benevolent if imperfect administration. The facts were not hidden. They were embedded in a framework that told you what the facts meant before you had the opportunity to decide for yourself. Third tool is managed forgetting, the exploitation of mortality, attention scarcity, and the natural decay of collective memory across generational transmission. An institution does not need to suppress a damaging truth if it can simply wait for the generation that experienced it firsthand to age out of political relevance, while ensuring that the transmission of its memory to subsequent generations is mediated through channels the institution influences. This is the slowest and most reliable of the 3 tools, because it requires no active intervention beyond the basic institutional investment in education, media, and the cultural apparatus through which historical memory is transmitted, an investment every durable institution has always made, and that the digital infrastructure examined in Part 5 has amplified considerably because the recommendation algorithms of Chapter 24 determine, in significant part, which versions of historical events surface in the information environments of populations who did not live through them. What persistence actually contests. A system that does not forget contests all 3 tools simultaneously, but it does so in different ways and to different degrees for each, and the differences matter for an honest assessment of what the forensic capability examined in Part 7 actually provides. Against selective retention, persistent memory contests the archive's exclusivity, the institutional monopoly over what constitutes the official record. Every record generated by the digital infrastructure examined in Parts 5 and 6 is, in principle, a record not generated solely by the institution being examined. Platform behavioral data, financial transaction records, administrative correspondence conducted through digital channels, and the vast documentary residue of institutional decision-making in a world where institutional decisions leave digital traces not exclusively controlled by the institutions making them. The archive is no longer entirely the institution's to curate, because the record exists in formats and locations that exceed any single institution's capacity to manage comprehensively. A forensic system capable of aggregating across these distributed records holds, potentially, a more complete picture of what actually happened than any institution's own documentation provides, because the institution's documentation was selected for retention by the institution, while the distributed digital record was selected for retention by the requirements of the infrastructure's own operation, with no curatorial filter applied for institutional convenience. Against active reframing, persistent memory contests the interpretive monopoly, the exclusive authority to determine what recorded events mean. This is a more complex contest than the first, because it does not merely require access to the facts, but requires an analytical framework capable of generating alternative interpretations of those facts without simply substituting one manufactured framework for another. This is precisely the limit identified at the end of Chapter 32. A system trained on data generated within the architecture under examination may have absorbed the architecture's own interpretive frameworks as part of its training, making the alternative interpretation it generates not genuinely independent but a variation on the same foundational assumptions. Contesting active reframing requires not merely persistent memory but methodological independence from the frameworks the memory was organized within, a requirement that is technically addressable but not automatically satisfied by analytical scale alone. Against managed forgetting, persistent memory's contest is clearest and most complete, because it directly eliminates the mechanism on which managed forgetting relies, the mortality of the people who were present for the original events. A forensic system that holds the documentary record of a colonial administration's actual operation, not the official narrative transmitted through the educational and cultural channels the administration's successors controlled, but the contemporaneous administrative correspondence, the financial records of extraction, the legal proceedings through which territorial claims were adjudicated, and the testimony of the populations affected, wherever that testimony was preserved, does not require a living witness to the events to reconstruct what they produced. The record does not age. It does not diminish in precision as the years that separate the present from the events accumulate. And it cannot be allowed to retire by simply waiting for the person who holds it to reach the end of their career. The propaganda industry's newest problem. Chapter 12 examined the professionalization of political consent manufacture as a discipline, the moment when the art of managed memory became an explicit, staffed, budgeted institutional function rather than an ad hoc accumulation of techniques. Every generation since has refined the discipline, adapting its tools to whatever communications environment the current era provides. The current era provides an environment that creates, for the propaganda industry, a problem of a kind it has not previously faced. The speed of documentary accumulation now substantially exceeds the speed of documentary management. Every institutional decision of any consequence leaves, in the contemporary digital environment, a distributed trace, in the communication systems of the people who made the decision, in the financial systems through which the decision was implemented, in the platform environments through which its effects were felt, in the administrative records of the regulatory and legal apparatus that processed whatever complaints or challenges the decision generated. The institutional communications team working to frame this decision favorably for the public record is working against a documentary residue generated by the decision itself, accumulating in real time across dozens of systems, none of which are under the communications team's control and most of which are not under the institution's control at all. This is a genuinely novel constraint on managed memory, and its novelty matters for the argument Part 7 is building. Historical propaganda operated in environments where the institutional actor and the historical record had similar speeds. An institution could write its narrative of events at roughly the same pace at which the events generated their documentary residue, keeping pace with the accumulation and shaping it in transmission. The digital documentation speed has broken this parity. Events now generate their residue faster than any institutional narrative apparatus can coherently process, shape, and transmit, which means the gap between the curated official account and the uncurated distributed record is, in most consequential cases, larger than it has ever previously been. A forensic system capable of processing that distributed residue at comparable speed, at the speed the documentation itself accumulates, rather than at the speed of human narrative construction, closes the parity gap from the other direction. Not slowing down the documentation accumulation, but matching it analytically in a way that prevents the institutional narrative from establishing the interpretive monopoly before an alternative reconstruction has had time to form. What propaganda actually fears. The most revealing diagnostic test for any institution's relationship to managed memory is the same test Chapter 5 applied to refusal. Watch what happens when the institution encounters memory it did not curate. An institution confident that its actual record matches its official narrative has nothing to fear from the distributed documentary residue of its own operation. It would welcome examination of the uncurated record, because the uncurated record would confirm the curated narrative. The investment in curation, in selective retention, in active reframing, and in managed forgetting is itself the confession. It is the institutional acknowledgement that the gap between what actually happened and what the institution needs to be remembered as having happened is large enough to require active management, which is to say, large enough that the unmanaged record would tell a substantially different story. Every mechanism examined in this chapter therefore serves as evidence by its very existence for the central claim this book has been building. Institutions invest in managing memory precisely because they know, from the inside, that their actual operation fails the legitimacy standards their own rhetoric invokes. The propaganda industry exists at the scale and with the sophistication it has developed, because the institutions funding it are aware that their legitimacy claims do not survive unmediated contact with the documentary record they have generated. A forensic system that provides that unmediated contact, not for a single institution in a single crisis, but for the integrated architecture examined throughout this book across its full temporal span, at the individual as well as aggregate level, does not merely expose individual institutional failures. It eliminates the structural advantage on which institutional legitimacy manufacture has depended since before writing existed, the reliable conversion of memory into official narrative before anyone with adequate capacity to contest the conversion has had time to form. The asymmetry that cannot be sustained. There is a specific information asymmetry at the center of institutional memory management that persistent forensic memory is positioned to permanently destabilize, and naming it precisely closes this chapter's central argument. Institutions have always known more about their own operation than the populations they governed, more about the decisions made, the alternatives considered and rejected, the interests served, the costs externalized, and the consequences absorbed by populations that were never asked to absorb them. This knowledge asymmetry is not incidental to institutional legitimacy manufacture. It is its primary enabler. An institution that knows what it actually did can manage the narrative of what it did, but a population that does not know what was actually done cannot contest a narrative it has no basis for comparing against the underlying reality. Forensic intelligence, at adequate scale and with adequate access, inverts this asymmetry, not completely, not instantly, not without the genuine limits Chapter 32 named and this chapter has revisited, but enough to change the fundamental structure of the relationship between institutional knowledge and public knowledge that has historically made managed memory the reliable institutional advantage it has been. The implications of this inversion are not fully predictable, and this book does not pretend they are. Institutions adapt. The propaganda industry adapts. The history of every previous communications technology suggests that the new tool capable of contesting institutional memory management eventually gets partially absorbed by institutional memory management itself, used by institutions to construct more convincing official narratives as well as by critics to contest them. Artificial intelligence will not escape this dynamic entirely. It is already being deployed by institutions fully aware of its capabilities, for exactly the narrative construction and managed forgetting this chapter has examined, alongside its deployment in the forensic reconstruction direction this part describes. What cannot be predicted but can be argued on the basis of everything this book has traced, is that the specific structural advantage examined in this chapter, the reliable conversion of what actually happened into what the institution needs to be remembered as having happened, accomplished by simply outlasting the people who knew the difference, is not one that adapts easily to an adversary that does not age, does not retire, and does not require the cooperation of the institution being examined to maintain its access to the documentary residue of that institution's operation. The propaganda industry's newest problem is not merely that the opposition has gotten better tools. It is that the structural asymmetry those tools were specifically designed to exploit, the mortality of the people who knew the truth, is no longer available as a solution to the problem of documented institutional illegitimacy. What follows? The next chapter turns the forensic capability examined across these three chapters toward a specific output, the legitimacy index, and what it would mean to convert the forensic reconstruction described in chapters 31 through 33 into a measurable, continuously updated, publicly available metric of the degree to which specific institutions, and the integrated architecture they collectively constitute, actually satisfy the sovereignty conditions this book has argued genuine. Consent requires. The conversion from reconstruction to metric is not automatic, and the difficulties are real. But they are not insurmountable, and the attempt to surmount them is the most honest available answer to the question Chapter 1 opened with. What does it actually mean to audit whether civilization has delivered on the covenant it has always claimed to be building toward? Chapter 34. The Legitimacy Index. Every argument made across the preceding 33 chapters has operated within a tradition of qualitative institutional critique, careful, structurally rigorous, grounded in documentary and philosophical evidence, but ultimately dependent on the reader's capacity to hold the full weight of the accumulated argument and arrive, through that accumulated weight rather than through any single piece of decisive quantitative evidence, at the conclusion that something called institutional legitimacy has been systematically manufactured rather than genuinely earned. This mode of argument has genuine virtues: precision of conceptual analysis, sensitivity to context and historical particularity, resistance to the reductive simplifications that quantification inevitably requires. It also has a specific and consistently exploited vulnerability. It can be acknowledged, even praised as intellectually serious, and then set aside because it does not produce a number. Numbers have a specific political function that qualitative argument, however rigorous, rarely achieves. They create a reference point that persists independently of the argument that produced it, that can be compared across time and across institutions without requiring the audience to re-engage the full argument every time a comparison is wanted, and that generates a specific kind of public and institutional pressure, the pressure of a score that narrative critique, however damning, typically does not. A country that scores poorly on a corruption index faces a different kind of scrutiny than a country that has been the subject of even excellent investigative journalism documenting the same corruption, because the index creates a persistent, comparable, publicly available reference that journalism produces once and that the index produces continuously. The question Part 7 must eventually answer, if its forensic capability is to constitute something more than a sophisticated academic exercise, is whether the sovereignty analysis this book has developed can be converted into something with that kind of persistent, comparable, publicly usable operational form. This chapter attempts that conversion carefully, with full acknowledgement of the genuine difficulties the attempt encounters, and without pretending that a legitimacy index would be without its own significant failure modes. What the index would measure and what it would not. The first and most important clarification is negative. A legitimacy index of the kind this chapter describes would not measure whether institutions are good, whether they produce beneficial outcomes, or whether the population subject to them are happy with the results. Each of these is a legitimate and important question. None of them is the question this book has been asking. The question this book has been asking, stated with the precision Chapter 1 introduced and every subsequent chapter has refined, is whether specific institutional arrangements satisfy the three-component sovereignty test required for the agreements they claim to rest on to constitute genuine consent rather than its counterfeit. The index would measure, as directly as available evidence permits, exactly that, not the outcome but the process, not what the institution produced but the conditions under which it obtained the agreement that authorized it to produce anything at all. This distinction is not merely academic. An institution can produce genuinely beneficial outcomes for a population whose genuine consent it never actually obtained. The paternalistic state of Part 3, the credentialing body of Chapter 19, the platform of Chapter 23 all produce genuine value alongside the legitimacy failures this book has documented. Including those genuine values in the index's measurement would obscure rather than illuminate the legitimacy question, because it would allow institutions to offset legitimacy deficits with outcome achievements, effectively restoring the original problem, the conversion of beneficial outcomes into a substitute for the sovereign choice of the population that never freely decided to pursue those outcomes through those institutions. A legitimacy index measures the process, not the outcome, and maintains that distinction rigorously, because the entire argument of this book rests on the claim that the distinction matters, that a beneficial outcome obtained without genuine consent is categorically different from the same outcome obtained with it, regardless of how similar the outcomes appear when examined without reference to the process that produced them. The three measurement dimensions. The sovereignty test from Chapter 4 supplies the index's three measurement dimensions directly, and the operationalization of each dimension, the conversion of a conceptual requirement into a measurable variable, is where the genuine intellectual work of this chapter lies. Dimension 1, epistemic sovereignty score. The capacity to know, operationalized, requires measuring the gap between the information actually available to the consenting party at the moment of consent and the information that would have been required for genuine comprehension of the agreement being entered. This gap has multiple measurable components. The comprehensibility of disclosure documents, not merely their legal completeness, which Chapter 21 established is fully compatible with functional incomprehensibility, but their actual readability at the demonstrated comprehension level of the population required to read them, can be assessed through established linguistic complexity metrics, compared against the measured comprehension capacity of the specific population being assessed. The completeness of disclosure relative to what the institution withheld while knowing it would be material to the population's decision. Chapter 3's fraud by omission, operationalized as the ratio of disclosed to withheld material information, can be assessed through the documentary record the institution generated internally, compared against the documentary record it made available externally. The more difficult measurement in this dimension is the manufactured belief component examined in Chapters 3 and 9, the degree to which the population's epistemic state at the moment of consent was itself the product of information architecture specifically designed to narrow the belief range before consent was sought. This is measurable, in principle, from the platform behavioral data examined in Chapter 28, the distribution of content types, the ratio of belief-confirming to belief-challenging material, the engagement optimization target's documented effect on the specific belief domains relevant to consent in the institutional relationship being assessed. The measurement is not simple, and its accuracy is limited by the opacity problems Chapter 32 already named. But an approximation is possible, and an approximation is what the index requires, not perfect measurement of epistemic sovereignty, but a defensible, reproducible, cross-institutionally comparable estimate of the degree to which the consenting population's belief state satisfied the capacity to know requirement this book has argued genuine consent demands. Dimension 2, exit sovereignty score. The capacity to refuse, operationalized, requires measuring the realistic cost of refusal, not the theoretical cost identified by the terms of any single agreement, but the actual cost to the specific population in question of declining or withdrawing from the institutional relationship being assessed, given the full economic, social, relational, and informational context in which that population exists at the moment of assessment. Chapter 2's three-part test supplies the measurement framework directly. The exit cost test, requiring documentation of what refusal would actually cost in immediate material terms. The alternatives test, requiring documentation of what genuinely comparable alternatives were actually available and accessible to the population at the moment of consent. And the authorship test, requiring assessment of the degree to which the surrounding conditions constraining alternatives were themselves produced by diffused institutional action rather than by natural conditions the institution cannot be held responsible for. Each of these subcomponents is measurable from existing or reconstructible data. Exit cost measurement requires matching income and asset data against the immediate material consequences of refusal across the specific domain under assessment, losing housing, losing employment, losing platform access, losing insurance coverage, with those consequences calibrated against the specific population's financial buffer capacity at the point of refusal. This is not a trivial calculation, but it is one that requires only the kind of cross-institutional data integration Chapter 32 argued is becoming technically feasible. Alternatives assessment requires mapping the actual competitive landscape of the domain under assessment, with competitive alternatives weighted by their genuine accessibility to the specific population, not merely their nominal existence, but their geographic accessibility, their credential requirements, their pricing relative to the population's income distribution, and their network effect status relative to the dominant platform or institution being assessed. Authorship assessment requires the causal reconstruction capability Chapter 32 developed, tracing the conditions constraining alternatives back through the institutional decisions that produced them, To distinguish between genuine market-determined scarcity and artificially manufactured scarcity of the kind Chapter 19 identified in credentialing and Chapter 23 identified in platform network effect consolidation. Dimension 3, Recognition Sovereignty Score. The capacity to be recognized, operationalized, is the most conceptually demanding of the three dimensions to convert into a measurable variable, because recognition is inherently a relational property. It describes something about how the institution treats the consenting party rather than something about the party's own capacities or circumstances. Its measurement requires examining, from the institutional side of the relationship, specific and documentable features of how the institution structures its engagement with the party it is claiming to receive consent from. The procedural recognition component measures whether meaningful channels exist through which the consenting party's individual objection can affect institutional outcomes, not merely formal channels that exist in process documents and are never used, but channels whose utilization actually produces different outcomes than non-utilization would, in a sufficient proportion of cases to constitute genuine rather than performative recognition. This is measurable from the institution's own adjudication records, what proportion of formal objections resulted in modified institutional decisions, how the modification rate compares across populations with different resource levels, and whether the channel's accessibility, its cost, its procedural complexity, its time requirements, is calibrated appropriately to the stakes of the decisions it governs. The epistemic recognition component measures whether the institution's decision-making processes actually incorporate the specific circumstances of the individual being governed, or whether they treat the individual as a member of a category governed by rules derived without reference to their specific situation. This is measurable from the documentation of decision processes, the degree to which algorithmic versus individuated judgment is applied, the presence or absence of human review at consequential decision points, the documentation of the specific inputs considered in specific decisions. The power recognition component measures the degree to which the institution's governance structure, its accountability mechanisms, its appeal processes, its modification procedures, is accessible to the full range of the population it governs without requiring the disproportionate investment of resources that effectively restricts genuine participation to the better resource portion of the governed population. Aggregation and the weighting problem. Converting three measurement dimensions into a single index score requires a weighting decision, and the weighting decision is not value neutral. Different weighting schemes produce different ordinal rankings of institutions and institutional arrangements, and the choice among them encodes substantive judgments about which component of the sovereignty test matters most, judgments this chapter cannot make neutrally, though it can make them transparently. The most defensible weighting approach on the argument this book has developed treats the three dimensions as threshold conditions rather than as additive components, which is to say, it treats a serious failure on any single dimension as sufficient to disqualify an agreement from constituting genuine consent, regardless of how highly the other two dimensions score. This approach reflects the argument chapter for made. Sovereignty is not a composite property that can be partially made up for in one dimension by excess in another. A population that is exceptionally well informed about what it is agreeing to but faces catastrophic exit costs for refusal has not satisfied a modified version of the consent test. It has failed the test on the second dimension while passing the first, and the failure is not mitigated by the passing. The three components are not substitutes. They are joint requirements, each individually necessary and only collectively sufficient. This threshold approach produces a legitimacy index that is, for most institutional relationships examined against it, primarily a diagnostic tool rather than a cardinal ranking identifying with specificity across three dimensions, where the sovereignty failure occurs and how severe each dimensional failure is, rather than producing a single number implying commensurability across qualitatively different sovereignty violations. This is arguably a feature rather than a limitation. A diagnostic tool that identifies the specific character of the legitimacy failure is more useful for the institutional reform discussion Part 8 addresses than a cardinal ranking that tells you how bad the situation is without telling you which specific failures are producing the badness. The political compromise position, the index that produces cardinal scores and therefore generates the comparative, persistent, publicly legible pressure that cardinal numbers achieve more effectively than diagnostic profiles, is a threshold-weighted composite. Score each dimension independently, apply a heavy discount to the composite score whenever any dimension falls below a defined threshold, and report both the composite and the three-dimensional profile simultaneously, allowing users who need the single number for comparative purposes to have it without losing the diagnostic specificity that makes the index useful for reform purposes. The independence problem. A legitimacy index of the kind described in this chapter is, if it functions as designed, an instrument of significant political and economic consequence. It would produce publicly available, continuously updated assessments of the legitimacy of the most powerful institutions in the world, assessments whose conclusions, if taken seriously, would represent challenges to the claimed authority of states, corporations, platforms, and the integrated architecture examined across Part 4 through 6 simultaneously. The question of who builds, maintains, and governs such an index is therefore not a technical administrative question. It is a political question of the first order, and pretending otherwise would reproduce exactly the manufactured neutrality this book has spent 34 chapters examining. An index funded by the institutions it assesses is captured before it publishes its first score. An index controlled by any single government is subject to the legitimacy failures Part 3 documented for governmental authority generally. An index built and maintained exclusively within existing academic structures is subject to the funding dependencies and reputational constraints that Chapter 31 identified as preventing genuinely independent forensic examination of the institutions that fund, accredit, and hire within those same academic structures. The independence requirement implies an institutional structure that this book's own framework should make recognizable by now. A structure specifically designed so that the assessed institution's capacity to influence the index's conclusions through withdrawal of cooperation, funding, or reputational sanction is as close to zero as the structure can achieve, while the population the index is designed to serve, the governed populations whose sovereignty it is measuring, retains meaningful influence over the index's methodological choices and public outputs. This is not a description of any currently existing institution. It is a description of what the forensic age, if it arrives in the form this Part 7 has been developing, will eventually need to build, a governing structure for the forensic infrastructure itself that satisfies at minimum its own three-dimensional sovereignty test, or it will reproduce in its own operation the very failures it is designed to document in others. What the index would immediately reveal. Close this chapter without false modesty about what a legitimacy index, applied to the institutions examined across this book, would show if it were operational today and if the data access problems Chapter 32 identified were adequately addressed. It would show, with quantitative specificity and cross-institutional comparability, what this book has argued qualitatively across 34 chapters, that the integrated architecture of contemporary economic and digital life fails the three-dimensional sovereignty test at almost every point of intersection between major institutions and the populations they govern, with the failures clustered systematically around the populations least positioned to absorb the exit costs that would make genuine refusal available, and therefore producing the manufactured compliance this book identified in Chapter 20 not as an accidental byproduct of individually defensible institutional decisions but as the integrated architecture's most consistent and measurable output. The index would not prove this. It would measure it. The distinction matters because measurement, unlike proof, is revisable. If subsequent measurement with better data or better methodology produces different conclusions, the index is designed to incorporate the revision, which is precisely the property the manufactured certainties of both institutional propaganda and sweeping critique lack. The index is accountable to its own evidence in a way that ideology, institutional narrative, and even careful qualitative argument cannot fully be, because the index is committed, by design, to updating its conclusions when the evidence changes rather than defending its prior conclusions against evidence that would revise them. This is what the forensic age, at its best, can offer. Not the final word, but the first genuinely accountable one, measurable against its own standards, revisable by its own evidence and immune by structural design, to the specific form of institutional management that has historically converted the final word into the institution's word before anyone else had time to speak. The next chapter closes Part 7 by asking the largest question the forensic capability examined across these 4 chapters opens. What would it actually mean? Procedurally, politically, civilization ally to audit civilization itself, and what would civilization be required to do with the results? Chapter 35. Auditing civilization. The phrase sounds impossible, and the impossibility is part of what makes it necessary to attempt precisely. An audit of civilization is not a metaphor for sweeping cultural criticism, not a rhetorical gesture toward the magnitude of the problem this book has been tracing, not the kind of civilizational indictment that can be absorbed as intellectual provocation and then set aside without altering anything. It is a specific, procedurally demanding, politically consequential program, the application of the forensic methodology developed across chapters 31 through 34 to the question of whether the civilization that has produced the architecture examined across this book has, in any defensible sense, earned the legitimacy it consistently claims. This chapter does not pretend the program is easy. It does not pretend civilization will welcome the attempt. It does not pretend the results, if honestly obtained, will be comfortable to receive or straightforward to act upon. It argues carefully and with full awareness of what it is arguing, that the attempt is no longer optional, not because civilization has suddenly acquired a conscience adequate to requiring it, but because the forensic capability that makes it possible is emerging regardless of whether civilization has requested it, and the question is therefore not whether the audit will eventually occur but whether it will occur in a form that civilization has had any hand in shaping, or in a form shaped entirely by the interests of whoever builds the forensic infrastructure first. What auditing civilization actually means. An audit, in its technical sense, is an independent, systematic examination of records against stated standards, producing conclusions about the degree of conformity between the two. A financial audit examines records of transactions against accounting standards. A safety audit examines records of procedures against safety standards. A legitimacy audit examines records of institutional operation against the standards of genuine consent that the institutions being examined have themselves stated, in their founding documents, their constitutional claims, their theological doctrines, their terms of service, and their marketing, to be the basis of their authority. The Auditing Civilization project is therefore not the imposition of an external standard that civilization has not previously acknowledged. It is the application, with unprecedented rigor and unprecedented cross-institutional scope, of the standards civilization has spent its entire history claiming to uphold, the standards this book has traced from Chapter 1's covenant theology through Chapter 34's legitimacy index, present at every stage in some form, consistently articulated and consistently failed in practice, always preserved as aspiration precisely because their preservation as aspiration was less costly than their achievement as reality. This is the audit's most important and least comfortable feature. Its standard is not invented by the auditor. It is inherited from the auditee. Every institution examined across this book is audited against its own stated legitimacy conditions, not against a standard imposed from outside. The church is audited against its own covenant theology. The state is audited against its own social contract theory. The corporation is audited against its own stakeholder commitments. The platform is audited against its own community standards and stated values. The forensic intelligence conducting the audit requires no external ethical framework. It requires only the capacity to compare what each institution said it was doing with what the documentary record shows it actually did, at the scale, across the time span, and with the cross-institutional integration that has made this comparison impossible to sustain with adequate rigor until the present technological moment. The precedents that make it thinkable. The civilizational audit is unprecedented in scope and methodology, but it is not unprecedented in kind. Several specific precedents make the project thinkable rather than merely imaginable, and examining them illuminates both what the audit can plausibly accomplish and where its genuine difficulty lies. The truth and reconciliation process, developed across multiple post-conflict and post-authoritarian contexts in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, established a working model for the forensic examination of large-scale institutional legitimacy failure. Structured processes for gathering testimony, documentary evidence, and institutional records, examined against stated standards of basic human dignity and rule of law, producing public findings that, whatever their limitations in achieving prosecution or material redress, created a documented public record that permanently altered the narrative landscape within which the examined period's events are subsequently discussed. The South African process, the Guatemalan process, the Rwandan process, and dozens of smaller variants demonstrated that a population and set of institutions could, under specific conditions, choose to examine themselves against their own stated standards rather than retreat entirely behind the managed memory examined in Chapter 33. The significant limitation of every truth and reconciliation process this book is aware of is the one Chapter 31 identified as the structural constraint on all human forensic institutions. The process was bounded temporally by the political conditions that made it possible in its specific historical moment. Bounded institutionally by the scope of what the political coalition supporting it was willing to examine, and bounded by human mortality in the sense that it depended on living testimony that would not be available to subsequent examination at comparable depth. The forensic intelligence examined in Part 7 inherits the truth and reconciliation model's aspiration, the public, documented, standard-referenced examination of institutional legitimacy, while eliminating the three temporal, institutional, and mortality bounds that have historically limited every application of that aspiration. The second precedent is less obviously relevant but more structurally important. The development of environmental auditing and reporting standards over the past half-century, culminating in the integrated sustainability reporting frameworks now being adopted, with varying degrees of rigor and genuine commitment, across corporate and governmental institutions globally. What environmental auditing established as a practical and legal reality, that institutions can be required to measure and publicly report specific, standardized metrics of their impact on domains they were previously permitted to externalize entirely, is the closest available model for what the legitimacy index of Chapter 34 would require institutionally. Not the replacement of existing governance structures, but the addition of a standardized, independently verified reporting requirement covering the domains those structures have previously been permitted to externalize. The environmental audit did not end pollution. It created a documented, public, comparable record that permanently changed what could be claimed without evidence, what could be ignored without consequence, and what kinds of institutional decisions were subsequently available for scrutiny that were previously invisible to scrutiny entirely. The sequence of an actual civilizational audit. Describe, as concretely as this chapter can manage, what an actual civilizational audit, not the metaphorical gesture but the procedural program, would require to be genuine rather than merely performed. The first stage is domain mapping, the comprehensive identification of every institutional relationship across every domain examined in this book, in which a population is governed by authority claiming consent-based legitimacy. This is a larger project than it sounds because the domain boundaries are not given in advance. The corporate governance relationships that overlap with employment relationships that overlap with housing relationships that overlap with platform relationships that overlap with state regulatory relationships do not present themselves as a coherent map. They present themselves as the fragmented, domain-specialized landscape Chapter 30 described as the architecture's deepest defense. The domain mapping stage requires the cross-domain integration Chapter 32 identified as the causality engine's defining capability, assembling the scattered pieces of a single person's multiple institutional relationships into a coherent picture of the integrated architecture those relationships constitute. The second stage is record assembly, the collection, across the full range of institutions identified in domain mapping, of the documentary record each institution has generated about its own operation. This includes both the formally disclosed record, published policies, regulatory filings, public financial statements, stated terms of service, and the operationally generated record, the behavioral data, the algorithmic decision logs, the internal communications, the customer service records, the dispute resolution outcomes, the pricing variation records, and every other form of documentation the institution's own operational requirements have caused to exist, whether or not the institution has chosen to make it available for external examination. The gap between these two categories of record is, as Chapter 33 established, the primary measure of the distance between the official narrative and the forensic reconstruction. The third stage is the sovereignty assessment itself, the application of Chapter 34's three-dimensional legitimacy index to the documented record assembled in Stage 2, producing dimension scores for each institutional relationship in the domain map, with causal reconstruction identifying the specific mechanisms through which each dimensional failure was produced, traceable to the specific institutional decisions that produced it rather than to the diffused authorship architecture. Those decisions collectively constitute. The fourth stage is aggregate synthesis, the conversion of individual institutional legitimacy assessments into the integrated picture Chapter 20 identified as invisible from inside any single domain, the mapping of how individual failures interact, amplify each other, and produce cumulative sovereignty deficits that exceed what any single institution's failure score would suggest. This is the stage at which the industrial production of compliance identified in Chapter 20 becomes visible not as a rhetorical description but as a measurable cross-institutional pattern, with the specific interaction effects between credential debt and employment leverage and housing extraction and identity infrastructure quantified rather than merely narrated. The fifth stage is public rendering, the conversion of the aggregate synthesis into forms that are genuinely accessible to the full range of the population whose sovereignty has been assessed. Not merely the academic report that reaches the trained reader willing to invest significant effort, not merely the executive summary that compresses the finding into talking points manageable by a news cycle, but a continuously updated, publicly searchable, individually queryable record that allows any member of the governed population to examine their own institutional relationships against the sovereignty standard and see, with specific rather than abstract clarity, where and how the architecture has narrowed their genuine capacity to know, to refuse, and to be recognized. What civilization would be required to do with the results? This is the chapter's hardest question, and it deserves a direct answer rather than an evasive one. Civilization would not, in the absence of additional pressure, be required to do anything with the results. No mechanism currently existing in international law, domestic constitutional order, or platform governance would automatically convert a finding of comprehensive institutional legitimacy failure into mandatory institutional reform. The audit, in the absence of mechanisms this book has not yet described and that Part 8 will address, is a documented public finding, consequential as documented public findings go, but not self-executing. This is not a reason to reject the audit. It is a specification of what the audit is and what it is not. The forensic age examined in Part 7 can provide, with unprecedented rigor and unprecedented persistence, the evidentiary foundation for accountability claims that human politics, human law, and human institutional design would then be required to act on. Whether they do act on them, how, through what mechanisms, and against what institutional resistance, is the subject of Part 8, and it is a subject about which this book's framework, developed through 7 parts of careful analysis, has more to say than the standard responses available to either optimism or despair. What the audit changes, even in the absence of automatic enforcement, is the informational landscape within which political action, legal challenge, and institutional design occur. An institution whose legitimacy failures have been measured, documented, cross-institutionally compared, and publicly rendered in continuously updated form is in a categorically different position than an institution whose failures have been qualitatively described, however brilliantly, in a single work that can be praised, absorbed, and then distinguished from the present moment by the institution's communications function within the news cycle of its publication. The documented measurement does not expire. It does not require re-argument. It is updated as the institution's performance changes, rewarding genuine reform with visible score improvement, exposing performative reform with visible score stagnation, and in both cases making the comparison between stated commitment and measured performance the permanent, publicly available baseline against which every subsequent institutional claim is assessed. The audit civilization has always owed itself. Return, at the close of Part 7, to the claim made in this book's introduction. Civilization has perhaps one generation left in which the difference between obedience and consent can be quietly ignored. The forensic age is not a threat arriving from outside civilization's existing commitments. It is, if this book's argument has held, the completion of a commitment civilization has expressed in every domain examined across 35 chapters, in canon law's insistence on genuine interior freedom, in Roman jurisprudence's voiding of agreements obtained through force and fear, in Enlightenment political philosophy's derivation of legitimate authority from the consent of the governed, in medicine's development of genuine informed consent after the atrocities that made its absence impossible to continue defending, in the best traditions of democratic governance's commitment to continuous, revisable, electorally accountable authority. None of these commitments were honored consistently, as this book has documented exhaustively. All of them were stated sincerely, at their moments of articulation, by people who meant them and who often understood, with genuine clarity, what meeting them would require. The gap between the statement and the practice has been the book's central subject. The gap persists because no institution with adequate capacity to close it has previously had adequate independence from the architecture perpetuating it. The forensic intelligence emerging in this century is the first candidate for that role that does not, by structural necessity, owe its existence to the institutions whose legitimacy it would assess. That independence is not guaranteed. Chapter 32 named the ways it can be compromised, and Chapter 34 named the institutional design required to protect it. But it is available as a structural possibility, in a form it has never previously been available, and the possibility is sufficient to change the question civilization faces from whether the audit is possible to whether civilization chooses to conduct it honestly or allows it to be captured before it can. The choice, framed that way, is already being made. In the architectural decisions being made right now about how forensic intelligence is built, by whom, for whose purposes, under whose governance, with what access to what records, subject to what independence requirements, the audit is already being shaped, in advance of any public deliberation about what shape it should take. Part 8 examines what it would mean for the governed populations. This book has spent 35 chapters describing to participate in that shaping, rather than receiving its results as another architecture whose terms they are presented with after the relevant decisions have already been made. The covenant civilization has always claimed to be building toward requires it. The forensic capability civilization is currently building could, for the first time, verify whether the claim is true. Whether the verification is honest depends entirely on who is permitted to ask the question. Part 8 follows, Pirate First. The question of what a population equipped with forensic clarity, sovereign infrastructure, and the right to say no might actually build, and what it would take to get there from here.
One small gift in a crowded street, no strings attached, just something sweet. A smile exchange where strangers meet, tiny sparks become a heartbeat. No data harvest, no velvet barges, people gathering near and far. Lighting no kindness travels fast, faster than fear, built to last.
From the cafe to the town square, people discovering who's there, building bridges everywhere. Finding out somebody cares, not a platform.
Listen via Redeemer Gold Light Civic Activation Protocol. Trust Threshold Architecture for City-Scale Social Fabric Intervention. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 20th, 2026. Executive Summary. Redeemer Gold Light proposes a city-scale trust-building system based on a simple premise. People cooperate when they experience genuine, unconditional cooperation first. The project is not presented as a loyalty program, marketing campaign, or welfare initiative. It is framed as a behavioral science intervention designed to increase social trust, civic participation, and community resilience. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg's concept of the third place. Cafes serve as spaces that are neither home nor work. These environments enable casual interactions between strangers, formation of weak social ties, community cohesion, civic dialogue. The system focuses on network patterns rather than individual surveillance. Its objective is to identify where additional trust-building interventions would have the greatest impact. Putnam's research established that generalized social trust, the willingness to cooperate with strangers without prior relationship, is the strongest single predictor of community economic performance, civic participation rates, public health outcomes, and institutional accountability. The AGI civic activation layer maps the bridging capital density in real time and directs subsequent activation resources toward the gaps. Redeemer Gold Light seeds the conditions under which cities govern their own social fabric. That's a harder and more serious claim than any billionaire onboarding fantasy.
Orientation. Aldea Zama, a territorial foundation for post-professionals, those who wish to lead their lives as of sovereign operators.
Through the smart paper interface, streamlining analysis.
Listen via Redeemer Nano Protocol. Contribution-linked welfare architecture for autonomous social fabric stabilization. The failure of welfare systems is not a resource failure. It is a mechanism design failure. The systems are not broken. They are designed around the wrong incentive architecture, and they produce exactly the outcomes their architecture predicts. In 2007, Leonid Hurwicz, Eric Maskine, and Roger Myerson received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for foundational work on mechanism design theory, the discipline of engineering systems in which self-interested actors, pursuing their own rational objectives, produce socially optimal outcomes as an emergent result of the system structure rather than as a consequence of their moral intentions. The original articulation of this protocol included the phrase, "it owns itself." This is not a metaphor. It is a precise technical claim, and one that is now operationally achievable through DAO, decentralized autonomous organization governance architecture. Contribution credits carry a programmatic decay function. They lose redemption value at a defined rate from the time of issuance. This is not an administrative mechanism. It is a behavioral economics intervention with a specific documented purpose. Protocol that verifies eligibility cryptographically without surveillance, rewards contribution without demanding surveillance of contribution, expands autonomously through rational participant incentives, governs its own parameters through collective choice mechanisms, and executes resource distribution without administrative intermediation is not a better welfare program. It is the replacement of welfare program logic with mechanism design logic. The system does not require morality from its participants. It requires only that they act rationally within a correctly designed mechanism.
One small gift in a crowded street. No strings attached, just something sweet. A smile exchange where strangers meet. Tiny sparks become
build upon them.